If you have seen the previous video, you are already aware of the Olmec civilization and its alleged connection to ancient Egyptians, and it's actually a pretty common theme among pre-Columbian contact theorists that the Olmec must have had contact with some other culture who influenced them somehow. One of these revolves around the Chinese refugees who fled at the end of the Shang dynasty in 1200 BC. These refugees would basically vanish, and there's no record of where they went. But coincidentally, or maybe not, right around the same time these people left China is the same time that the Olmec civilization popped up in Mesoamerica. This serves as the basis of the theory that the Chinese and Olmec had contact. Although I was not able to find a starting point for this theory, it's been discussed since at least the 1960s by various historians, and it's not just the so-called crackpot ones either. Even Betty Meggers, the archaeologist best known for her work in South America and was considered influential by the Smithsonian for all of her research, even theorized that the Olmecs originated due to the Shang Chinese influences. But like some of you may be thinking, nice theory, but surely it involves more than the fall of the Shang dynasty and the pop-up of the Olmec happening around the same time, right? Well, there is at least one other thing, which was found in La Venta, a famous pre-Columbian archaeological site of the Olmecs, in present-day Tabasco, Mexico. Here at this civic/ceremonial center, you can find a pyramid, as well as those famous colossal heads we discussed a few times now. But the thing found here that relates to our claim is the La Venta Celts, not the Celtic peoples. A Celt is a long, thin prehistoric stone or bronze tool, sorta like an axe or adze. Some of these have been recovered at La Venta and are found to have inscriptions on them. And according to Mike Shue, author of The Origin of the Olmec Civilization, the characters of these Celts are Chinese characters. In fact, 146 of the symbols studied showed the characters were 100% identical. Mike argued that these tools, in addition to Olmec pottery, which had similar markings, are comparable to Chinese oracle bone writing, the oldest form of written Chinese. Not to mention, the word in Maya for chicken is qi or chi, while the word for chicken in Chinese is chi. He also drew comparisons to the significance of jade to both cultures of the Olmec and Chinese, as well as both cultures knowing the position of true north, and their parallels in religion, astronomy, and art, including statues with Asian features and shared deity motifs. He also compared several items found at the archaeological site with ancient Chinese items. I was even able to find at least one source that discussed Chinese DNA in the Maya of Yucatan and indigenous people of Navarrete, Mexico. Of course, that DNA could have came much later, but there are other genetic links, like Chihuahuas may be linked to Chinese miniature dogs, as well as the Chinese rose was allegedly already on Mexico's west coast when the Spanish arrived, while a Chinese junk ship, believed to have sunk in 1423, was found near the Philippines in 1993, containing artifacts from Mexico, such as grinding stones for corn made of volcanic stone found only in Mexico and South America. And as mentioned several times before, most of the natives in South America had legends of ships that arrived predating Europeans. But did the Chinese actually visit South America before Europeans? And are these inscriptions actually ancient Chinese characters? Is it possible to compare the meanings of these Olmec characters to the corresponding Chinese characters to see if they have the same meaning? See, that's the big issue. The ancient Olmec script has not been decoded, well, at least officially. The Isthmian script was first said to have been partially deciphered in 1993, but just over a decade later, their claims became heavily disputed by many scholars, and to this day, it is still officially undeciphered. And in ways, that makes it easier for the so-called fringe theories to connect this writing to many other ancient ones, because we have no idea what it's saying. We don't even know if the Isthmian script is even a writing system that represents a spoken language, or if it's some kind of proto-writing system used by early Neolithic peoples, consisting of visible marks communicating limited information. In addition, there is a lack of archaeological evidence of any direct connection between the Olmec and Shang cultures, and it's only made more complicated by the fact that the Olmec culture is still relatively poorly understood. Not to mention the big key: why were there no horses and no wheels when the Europeans arrived? Surely the ancient Chinese would have left them with that technology. Selkie Legends based on pre-Columbian contact with the Inuits. If you recall in the last edition of this series, we briefly touched upon a mythological creature known as the Selkie, a topic you wouldn't think would come up on this iceberg, because Selkie are basically like an old version of cryptids. They allegedly can shapeshift between seal and human forms, all by removing or putting on the said seal skin. It traces its origin back to the oral traditions of both the Celtic and the Norse peoples, and it's very prominent among Scottish folklore, especially in the Northern Isles, where they are said to live as seals in the sea and shed their skin once they get on land and live as humans. But just why did this myth start? Well, there seems to be a few theories. First was the early settlers in Scotland encountered and then sometimes even end up marrying Finnish and Sami women who used sealskin kayaks and clothing. Upon first seeing them, it's thought they were identified as Selkie, and the legend kinda grew from that. Another theory sorta similar was that shipwrecked Spaniards that washed ashore and that were seen by locals who thought, with their jet black hair, were possibly seals before washing ashore as man, which again became a legend. But let's talk about the claim that gets it on this iceberg, that of the Fen men, which we also discussed in a previous video. These were Inuit whose clothes and kayaks were made up of animal skins, and in both cases, the kayaks and clothing would become drenched in water and lose buoyancy, which of course, the Inuit would then go on land and wait for them to dry out. It's thought they would go on the rocks, remove their clothing, and lie down next to the skins that came from both clothing and kayak while waiting for them to dry. Anyone from this time period traveling by seeing this might possibly think they just seen a seal transform into a human, which of course brings us back to the theory, which we already basically discussed before. Were the Inuits traveling to Europe before Europeans were going to the New World? American Ogham inscriptions. Ogham, a word many of you may have never heard before, is quite simply an early medieval alphabet used to write the early Irish language between 4th and 6th century AD, known as the Orthodox inscriptions, as well as being used for Old Irish between the 6th and 9th centuries, also known as Scholastic Ogham. The former category, that of the Orthodox inscriptions, survive today on stone monuments throughout Ireland and West Britain, with around 400 existing. Most of these inscriptions contain rather simple information, like personal names. Now, the origins of these writing systems are still debated to this day, with some believing that it actually goes as far back as the 1st century BC. But it's not really important to our claim at hand. In fact, we are only really going to be discussing the latter version of the script, that known as Ogham. And that's because according to some Pre-Columbian claims, there are numerous Ogham inscriptions all over North America, especially on the East Coast, but as far as west as Oklahoma and Nevada, which leads us to the question, if this writing goes back to between the 6th and 9th centuries, does that mean Irish explorers made it in that time period, hundreds of years before Columbus? A lot of this goes back to the Voyages of St. Brendan, which we also discussed in a previous video, who was an Irish monk in the 6th century who allegedly made all these trips to America. This theory speculates that after he came back and told the Irish of his discoveries, it kicked off an age of Irish exploration, which then led to all these Irish explorers leaving petroglyphs around North America. As mentioned, there are several that we can choose from, but maybe the most famous one comes from West Virginia. In 1982, an archaeologist named Dr. Robert Paul would go to research an inscription known to the area. Paul thought this one was unique and did not consider that it could be Native American, instead believing it might actually be runic, hence the possibility of Vikings making it as far south as West Virginia. He was eventually able, however, to date the carvings between 500 and 700 AD. He then went on to record every detail of the carving and give it to a local newspaper, where the story began to circulate and was eventually found by a freelance writer in Connecticut who had researched a similar inscription in the New England area. She eventually linked up with Paul, and the two would go look at the inscription together. She was convinced that they were looking at something groundbreaking, so she contacted Harvard professor Barry Fell, an expert on ancient inscriptions, and he would go look at it as well. He immediately stated it was Ogham, the same ancient Celtic script he had studied in Ireland. He would then begin translating the script to Old Irish, and then from Old Irish to Modern Irish, and then to English. He found that it stated, "A ray will graze the notch on the top left side at the time of the sunrise on Christmas Day, the first season of the year, the season, the blessed advent of the Savior Lord Christ." Behold, he is born of Mary, a woman. To test out this claim, a small group went out on December 21st, 1982, the beginning of the winter solstice when Christmas was originally celebrated, and they waited for the sun to come out behind the mountains, and its rays hit the notch in the cliff overhang, and like a flashlight beam, it struck dead center of the sun symbol on the inscription. And since the sun rises in a slightly different spot every morning, this was the only morning of the year the sunspot was hit by sunlight. The team continued to watch as the sun rose over and displayed the entire message. It was here that confirmed that it had been carved in Ogham. Shortly after this, the story got crazier, as the investigative team learned of another petroglyph in a nearby area called Boone County, where an inscription was found at Horse Creek. This one was larger than the first one, and Dr. Feld could not believe it. He thought it might be the longest Ogham message found to date, and he believed it to have been made around the 7th century. This time the inscription read, "A happy season is Christmas, a time of joy and goodwill for all people." The second line read, "A virgin was with child. God ordained her to conceive and be fruitful. Behold, a miracle." The third line read, "She gave birth to a son in a cave. The name of the cave was Cave of Bethlehem. His foster father gave him the name Jesus, the Christ, Alpha and Omega, festive season of prayer." So a remarkable discovery, right? Well, as you can imagine, this theory was heavily disputed. In fact, once others began to study the old inscriptions, they pointed out that the Horse Creek inscription, as well as the other one found nearby, did not contain any vowels, which would be strange since there is no evidence anywhere in Ireland of a form of Ogham existing without vowels. And while we're on the subject, now is a good time to point out this writing system does not actually contain letters. Instead, it's actually made up of 20 distinct characters on either side of or across a continuous line. And since we know that part, the most obvious theory comes back around to the forefront. None of these are Ogham. Instead, they are markings left by the indigenous Americans, possibly even just bored Indians that were doodling. Although the ones found in the western states, like Colorado and Wyoming, may have been counts or tallies potentially used for recording buffalo hunts. Björn Breiðvíkingakappi. Björn Breiðvíkingakappi, or known more simply as Björn Asbrandsson, is one Viking we have not discussed thus far in this series, although he was mentioned in the saga of the Icelanders, which covered historical events that took place in Iceland between the 9th and 11th centuries, in particular, the Eyrbyggja saga, or Saga of the People of Eri. Björn is featured prominently in one key part. According to the saga, a chieftain of western Iceland, Snorri Goði, who was featured in several of the sagas, would get into a feud with Björn. Apparently, Björn had an affair with Snorri's sister, who was also married, and it was a marriage that Snorri had helped to set up. In fact, Snorri was so mad, he would attempt to murder Björn, who was able to stop the attack and survived. But the damage was done, and Björn was convinced to leave Iceland. So in 998, he would board a ship and sail out to an exotic land. This is the last we would hear from Björn, at least officially. But about 32 years after Björn sailed off west into the ocean, a trade ship, captained by a man named Gudleif, would leave Ireland heading west when his ship would be blown off course. And it was so bad that he had lost control of the ship for many days and nights. Finally, the sagas would record that the ship came to land in a strange place the men had not seen before. The captain and his crew were immediately apprehended by the locals and brought to a chief. And when they seen this chief, they were perplexed, because he was a white-skinned, bearded man that spoke Norse. The chief would ask about his wife and relations back in Iceland before letting all the crew go. It was on this trip back to Iceland that Gudleif realized the man had to be Björn, who had disappeared decades ago. So just where was this land that Gudleif crashed on? Well, according to the theory, that of the Yucatan Peninsula, which is definitely not what you would expect. But a lot of this theory comes from the story of the Toltec myth of Quetzalcoatl, who the white-skinned and bearded chieftain is very similar to. Is it possible this man landing in Central America is the origin of the Toltec myth? Well, first, we have to look at the Toltec Empire, which was based in Hidalgo, Mexico. Scholars are not exactly sure how long it lasted, or when it started, because the records are spotty, but it may have began as early as 6th century AD, or as late as the 8th century, and lasted until the 11th century. The dating is important because this is around the height of the Viking explorations, and of course, as mentioned, this all ties back to Quetzalcoatl. a huge part of the Toltec society, and would later serve as the same for the Aztecs. But Quetzalcoatl was actually said to have been a real person who was once known as a warrior king. According to the story, he went afoul of the gods and was banished, where he got on a ship and made an eastward voyage. And maybe not coincidentally, that's around the same time the Toltec invaded and took over the peoples of the Yucatan Peninsula. So we come back to our narrative. Quetzalcoatl was said to come back to the Toltec about 5 centuries after this, which puts it around the same time that the Vikings were exploring modern-day Canada. And then coincidentally, the same time the Toltec myth about a white-skinned bearded god who sailed east and returned popped up. Not to mention, Quetzalcoatl's teachings have parallels with the Norse culture, such as the belief that warriors' souls join the gods and the practice of burning bodies on a pyre. So we have a lot of weird coincidences, but like a lot of these, there's just no real hard proof, with the only thing given remotely possible as proof is a mural on a temple at Chichen Itza that shows white figures seem to be enslaved by the Toltec. Proponents of this theory use this to show that other Vikings arrived and were then enslaved themselves. Of course, this is largely seen as pseudo-history, not to mention that the voyage itself would probably not be conceivable in the Viking ships. Plus, as we discussed in the Vinland sagas in the early episodes, all of these sagas were written down hundreds of years after the events occurred, and in the case of Bjorn, he was documented nearly 3 centuries later. Likewise, the so-called exotic land that he fled to could have just easily have been Spain, the Baltic, or anywhere in the Byzantine Empire. Pre-Columbian custard apples in India. The sugar apple is a fruit of the Ananaceae family, better known as the custard apple family, and is an edible fruit about 2 to 4 inches in diameter and 2 to 4 inches long. It's typically pale green to blue-green, whose flesh is fragrant and sweet and tastes like custard. It's native to the tropical subclimates in the Americas and West Indies, where it was then picked up by Spanish and Portuguese traders and shipped to other places in the world, where it successfully grew in places like the Philippines and India. So where does our claim come at in this one, you may be asking? Well, in 2008, researchers will begin looking at a Neolithic archaeological site that had been found in north-central India called Tokwa. While doing dating on random items, such as a wood charcoal sample, the team decided to also test a seed sample from a custard apple, and they were a bit surprised to find out that the seed dated back to 1520 BC. So how did a fruit native to South America and the West Indies that was brought over by the Portuguese in the 16th century find its way to India 3 millennia before? Unfortunately, there's not much on this one, so you just have to come up with your own conclusions. Marco Polo Alaskan maps. Marco Polo was widely known as the Venetian man who traveled to China along the Silk Road in 1271 and came back in 1295, where he would soon join Venice's war efforts against Genoa, only to be captured and imprisoned, where he would retell detailed accounts of his travels to China to a man named Rustichello de Pisa, his cellmate, who published the book The Travels of Marco Polo in 1300. But that's something almost everyone knows. We're going to look at the next pre-Columbian claim that not a lot of people know about, although we did reference it in an earlier video. First, we have to go back to the 1930s, when an Italian immigrant named Marcian Rossi would arrive in the United States. With him, he brought 14 documents that he claimed had been passed down in his family for generations. Now these documents included some maps, and according to the story, were all handed down by Marco Polo to a trusted admiral he knew, who then passed it down to the Rossi family. All except for one, which was donated to the Library of Congress. This document had the unfortunate name of Map with Ship, and it shows a map of Eastern Asia and what appears to be a part of Alaska. It contains writing in Chinese, Arabic, and Latin, which gives some notes on various places on the map. And of course, I don't have to explain it to you, but how did Marco Polo come across a map that showed Alaska in the 13th century, nearly 200 years before the Columbus expedition? Well, that's why it's so important. Of course, no one is just going to take the story at its word, and recent radiocarbon dating does show this particular piece dates back to the 15th or 16th centuries. So one thing's for sure, this is not the original Polo Alaska map, if one ever existed. Instead, this is a copy of that map, or maybe someone just forged it for who knows what reason. But there's more. On one of the documents is writing allegedly by the daughters of Marco Polo, specifically one by Belela Polo, where she would tell about her father's journey to North America via the Bering Strait after meeting a Syrian trader on the Kamchatka Peninsula. She would note that after this, the people he came across spoke the Tartar language and dressed in sealskins and lived on fish, which sounds a lot like maybe Marco Polo made it to the Aleutian Islands where he ran into the Inuit. People who believe this claim suggest that Kublai Khan sent Polo on a mission to explore the source of the furs, precious stones, and other goods being imported into China. However, there are doubters. For one, it's never recorded once in the travels of Marco Polo about him keeping personal maps or of any lands he knew about beyond Asia, although he did once brag that he did not tell half of what he saw. But if it was a hoax, then it was unlikely to be that of Marcian Rossi, since the inscriptions are in Italian, Latin, Arabic, and Chinese, and Rossi was not known to know any of these languages. Or did he? I was able to find at least one other source that stated that Rossi was actually an amateur historian and science fiction writer who had previously got caught up in hoaxes. One of these was a map allegedly drawn by Pliny the Elder, and although the radiocarbon dating takes it back to the 15th or 16th centuries, the writing styles on the associated documents date it closer to the 18th century. One major problem with this one is the ink has still not been tested. Granby Idol. During the summer of 1920, or 22, depending on the source, a man named Bud Chalmers of Grand County, Colorado, began excavating a new garage, or cellar, depending on the source, and he was digging at about 12 feet when he came across some utensils and other archaeological finds. But it's what he would find next that blew him away, when he would come across an extraordinary discovery. As he took his horse-drawn scraper over to an area where he was dumping the dirt, he noticed an unusually heavy stone in the soil. When he looked closer, he seen that it had been sculpted. The artifact weighed about 66 pounds and was a solid piece of blue granite, and was 14 inches tall and 9 inches wide and about 12 inches front to back, which depicted a three-fingered man squatting on his haunches, holding a table featuring strange hieroglyphics, and most shocking of all, drawings of a sauropod dinosaur, a theropod dinosaur, and a mastodon, as well as a saber-toothed tiger. Now this stone was viewed as super important to a certain group of researchers and historians, specifically those who believed that man and dinosaur coexisted together, which would prove, at least according to them, the creationist theory was true. One of the first archaeologists to look at the stone and then become a proponent of its legitimacy was that of Jean Aller-Joncon, a curator of the Colorado Historical Society. He believed once it could be proven as genuine, it would be the biggest find ever in anthropological research history. After this, the stone began being researched by other archaeologists, and rubbings were sent far and wide. And to the surprise of many, the varnish on the stone made it as hard as steel, which he concluded that it would have been difficult to fake. Likewise, there were no markings from tools found. But there were other things that stood out. The human face was similar to that of the Cro-Magnon look, the earliest humans to settle in Europe. Likewise, there was a deep depression on the upper part of the nose, which has been found on some skulls from a later period in the Pagosa Piedra region of Colorado. The rock also showed signs of being buried for a long time. However, the majority of historians and archaeologists dismissed the stone, for the obvious reason that man came about 65 million years after dinosaurs went extinct, which has led to supporters of the dinosaur-humans coexisting theory as claiming that the powers that be are trying to cover up the fact, for whatever reason. Others disagree with both the creationists and skeptics, and claim that the rock, because of some symbols that were on the stone, was of ancient Chinese origin, which of course brings us back to the ancient Chinese explorer theory. One researcher in particular was a Dr. Cyclone Covey at Wake Forest, who believed the stone was a marker for Chinese explorers. In fact, he believed the words on the stone translated to north, river, fruit, and fish, and that the rock could be traced to stone commonly found in northern China. And you may be thinking, why can't they just test the stone? Yeah, about that. Shortly after the discovery of the item, now known as the Granby Idol, an outsider named Henry F. Knight came to town and convinced Bud Chalmers that the stone needed to be housed at a museum and gave Bud $300 for it, or about $4,700 in today's money. Henry Knight would then take the stone back east, and it was never seen again. Crazily enough, we would not have any proof of this stone whatsoever if not for a schoolteacher named Leela Smith, who went over to Bud's home and took 3 photographs. These photographs are the only proof of the stone's existence, Although there have been duplicates made since then based on the photos, the original stone somehow became lost or destroyed. No one is quite sure. Regardless, most archaeologists claim that even looking at these old images, it is incredibly easy to see the makings of a fraud. Madoc's Voyages / Welsh Indians. 1170 AD, the Welsh king, Owain of Gwynedd, considered one of the greatest Welsh rulers of the Middle Ages, would finally pass away. And unfortunately, as good of a ruler as he was, he didn't leave a good plan for after his death, as his 13 legitimate children and a number of other illegitimate children would begin to plot about who would take the throne, and soon, war began upon each other, except for a few of his sons. In fact, it's one particular one that brings us to this next Pre-Columbian claim, that of Madoc, who was a man of peace and did not want to be involved in a war for the throne. So he and his brother, Rhirid, would come up with another plan. They decided to take a couple of ships and sail west, taking along with them 100 men, women, and children, and Madoc never returned, but instead landed in the New World, and in all of places, Mobile Bay, Alabama. Wait, maybe we should back up some. Where does this tale actually get started at? Unfortunately, that's a little blurry too, because the story actually only has references to the original source, which has never been found. The earliest known reference, however, to a seafaring Madoc appears in a Welsh poem in the mid-15th century, just before the Columbus expedition, and it mentions a descendant of King Owain Gwynedd who voyaged to the sea, although a Flemish writer named Willem between 1250 and 1255, almost a century after Madoc's alleged travel, would pen a poem and sign it with the name Willem, the author of Madoc, though this work doesn't survive either. But there is at least one account that claims the work was discovered in the 17th century, and while it did not detail North America per se, it did state Madoc's goal was to launch a new kingdom of love and music. Now these claims don't really matter as far as what they say, and matter more about the timeline, since it proves Madoc came before Columbus, because it's after Columbus's discovery of the New World that the story would gain momentum, especially in the 1500s and in England, who now wanted to use the story of Madoc as a proof of claim on the American continent. By 1559, we would get the first full account that we still have that claims that Madoc was in America before Columbus, hence makes it English property. Some versions after this would even elaborate after discovering the land and founding a colony in 1170, he returned to Wales to recruit additional settlers, and returned with 120 men, women, and children, and they sailed to the western country and ported in Mexico and never returned to Wales. By the early 17th century, as more and more immigrants were coming into contact with Native American groups, they began to suspect they were the so-called Welsh Indians. One exploration particularly near the James River in Virginia led to the explorers thinking the Monacan people spoke a language very close to the Welsh language. They would even try to get a Welsh speaker to translate, but to make matters worse, the Algonquin peoples typically referred to tribes that were not Algonquin, like the Monacan people, as Manodag, and it's probably important to point out now that Madoc was also recorded in some old Welsh chronicles as Madog, so you could see why the English may have thought they found Welsh Indians. Other tales would pop up after this, like the famous William Penn, the Quaker who founded the province of Pennsylvania, and seen his deputy be captured by members of a tribe in North America known as the Doeg. The chief here, however, spared the man because he spoke Welsh, to which the chief allegedly recognized. This led to a Reverend Morgan Jones, who then went to live with the Doeg and preached the gospel to them for months in Welsh, although that has now largely been proven to have all been a legend. But it didn't matter, because even 200 years later, Thomas Jefferson would write a letter to Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expeditions, where he mentions searching for the Welsh Indians said to be living up in Missouri, and instructed the two explorers to find them. In all, up to 18 different tribes have been connected to the Welsh Indians, before finally being connected to the Mandan tribe, whose culture, language, and appearance were said to be much different than their neighboring tribes. They also found the Mandan boats were very similar to the coracle, a Welsh lightweight boat, as well as the advanced architecture of the Mandan, which was suggested must have been learned from the Europeans. Things like stone forts and permanent settlements, which were unusual to other tribes in the area, not to mention their language was somewhat similar to the Welsh. This basically was the beginning of the White Indians legend, which alleged the natives with European features were wiped out by other Indians near the Ohio River, especially around Louisville, where alleged earthen mounds called the Devil's Backbone is, which really is just a natural rock formation, or other connections, like Tennessee Governor John Sevier in 1810 would record that the Cherokee chief, Oconnosota, claimed stone fortresses in Tennessee were built by white people who crossed the ocean long ago, and of course, Sevier thought this was the Welsh, as well as another report he wrote about finding 6 skeletons in brass armor bearing the Welsh coat of arms. It was even said that Columbus himself ran across wrecked ships in the West Indies that were of Welsh origin. And to just go full circle and return back to Quetzalcoatl, some people believe Madoc is the real inspiration for the Aztec god. But is there any actual real tangible proof for any of this? Not really, and chances are Madoc didn't even exist, as he was not mentioned in the 12th century annals. White Amazonian Indians. 1542, Spanish Dominican missionary Gaspar de Carvajal would write something rather mysterious in his account of the recent discovery of the famous Grand River, upon encountering a tribe of Amazonian women, where he would describe them as very white and tall, and had long hair braided and wound about their heads. This seemingly largely forgotten description would serve as the first of the so-called sightings of white-skinned natives living in the Amazonian rainforest, who kept on being encountered by Spanish missionaries. It would be British journalist Harold T. Wilkins who in 1945 would write Mysteries of Ancient South America that would compile numerous accounts he found written by explorers between the 16th and 19th centuries. In fact, this mystery has long been believed to be the catalyst for Percy Fawcett's exploration in the 1920s to find the lost city of Z. But these weren't just old accounts from hundreds of years ago. In fact, American explorer Alexander Hamilton Rice Jr. led an expedition in 1924 and 25 into the unmapped Amazonian regions and would record the 2 Indians bleached white by the sun, but pure Indian, came out to meet Dr. Rice and the party. He described them as being undersized and undernourished. Their faces were streaked with pigments, so it was hard to determine their features, but they were definitely white. They wore no clothing, only carrying bows whose arrows were tipped with poison. When the 2 received presents of beads and handkerchiefs, they yelled for their companions, and soon 20 men and 2 women joined the group. So just who were these so-called white Indians? One of the prevailing theories is that it is a group called Paracana Indians. The Paracana do have some light-skinned natives, but for the most part, they're not much different than other Amera Indians. Another group is called the Ashi, who are traditional hunter-gatherers living in Paraguay. The earliest descriptions of them emphasize their white skin, light eyes, and hair colors, as well as their heavy beards. They were also reported to have Asiatic features. Because of this, sometimes writers would claim that they were the descendants of Vikings or other shipwrecked sailors, while others have said they could be from early Japanese explorers. By 1996, one study finally concluded that they were actually different genetically and physically than most South American tribes. However, they have no connection to Europe or Africa. Another theory brought up is that of the Guna people of Panama and Colombia, who have a high incidence rate of albinism, which leads the Westerners calling them white Indians. Regardless, whatever tribe was responsible for the sightings, it's almost certain they are not of European descent. However, there are still some who use this as proof of pre-Columbian explorers. Satanazes. Satanazes is one we covered previously in an earlier video discussing the Pizzigano chart, which was a portolan chart created by a 15th century Venetian cartographer, Zueni Pizzigano. On this chart that predated the Columbus voyage by almost 70 years, debuting in 1424, would show the fabled set of islands in the western Atlantic called Antilia, Satanazes, Roilo, and Tamar. But it's here we focus on Satanazes, which is listed as a geographic legend on this iceberg. It is depicted as lying out in the northern Atlantic, west of the Azores, and north of Antilia. It is drawn as a large blue rectangular island and shown to have bays and 5 to 6 settlements, with an inscription that translates to, "This is the island called of the Devils." Strangely enough, even though the other islands were a fixture on most maps up until the Columbus expedition, which done away with the fictional island chain, Satanazes would not appear on every map. It showed up on the original Pizzigano chart and then 2 separate maps in 1435 and 1436, and then it vanished close to 30 years until it popped up again on a couple of 1460s maps. while all the other islands were shown to exist basically on every map up until Columbus. But our mystery revolves around the actual meaning of the island's name and where it came from, because it could possibly indicate pre-Columbian contact. Satanazes is Portuguese for Satans or devils. Likewise, the 1435 map by Genoese cartographer Battista Beccario labeled the island as Santiago, which means the same thing, as well as the 1436 map by a Venetian cartographer Andrea Bianco, who labeled it as Sant'Anaxio. When it would pop up back on maps in 1462, it did so on a map by navigator Cyriacus of Ancona, who switched the island's name to Savaga, meaning savage, which kinda leads to the mystery, because some thought that Cyriacus simply meant Satanazes, but others believe he intentionally wrote it as savage to avoid using the profanity of devil. But some have wondered, what if the devils of Satanazes is a reference to the Skrælings, the indigenous peoples of Greenland and Vinland recorded by the Vikings? In fact, these Norse tales had begun to filter down to other parts of Europe at this time, and it could be that Pisagano was instead taking these tales and trying to place Greenland and Newfoundland on his map. This has been a theory for well over a century now, after noticing a 1508 map by Johannes Rush had an inscription on some islands between Newfoundland and Greenland that noted devils attacked sailors there, which suggests that Satanazes represents the coast of North America, while Antillia may be South America, which would mean that Europeans did know of the Americas before Columbus. Others take it a step further and suggest that the Pizzigano chart is the Caribbean and that Satanazes represents Florida. Others dispute this, of course, as Andrea Bianco's 1436 translation of Sant'Anaxio actually cites Yed de la Man Sant'Anaxio, which reads as the hand of Satan, which might actually connect to a legend from India about a giant hand rising from the sea and carrying inhabitants off into the ocean. It was first published in Europe in 1557, which means it's quite possible the tale had been in circulation from 100 to 200 years prior, which means it was nothing more than a legend that Pizzigano recorded on his map. This has been widely dismissed by modern historians, though. Others think that Satanazes is nothing more than a reference to seeing some icebergs in the North Atlantic, while others suggest that the De La Man Santiago on Bianco's label is actually two separate islands, Satanazes and Delaman, with Delaman being the legendary Isle of Man and the Sant'Anaxio actually being S. Antanaxio, or the island of Saint Athanasius, an important figure in Christian theology. Regardless of which one of these are true, Satanazes holds the rather unique distinction of not being connected to any of the old Iberian legends like the 7 cities that Antillia shares, which leaves it as an outlier. That brings us to the end of Part 4 of the Pre-Columbian Contact Claims Iceberg. Hope you all enjoyed. Until next time.